Never. Welcome everybody to this Cambridge Festival session, The Crisis in the Mental Health of Girls and Young Women and the Role of the Education System. Oh, is it making it worse? I'm Dorothy Byrne. I'm the president of Murray Edwards College, Cambridge, where we have established the Murray Edwards Policy Centre for the Wellbeing of Young Women and Girls to look at problems very like this. And with me, we have an absolutely terrific panel. Sarah-Jayne Blakemore, Professor of Psychology and Cognitive Neuroscience. Tamsin Ford, Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Head of the Department of Psychiatry. And Lauren Cross, former secondary school teacher, by chance, I have to say this, at my daughter's school, but we didn't know that before, and now studying for her PhD in applied mental health research. And I should say immediately that we know that young men and boys also have very significant mental health problems, and it's not that we are excluding them in our thinking, but tonight we are looking at the specific and particular problems of young women and girls. And I'm going to give you just 3 figures. The British Journal of Psychiatry, in a major study, found that between 2008 and 2018, the percentage of young women aged 18 to 24 with generalized anxiety disorder nearly quadrupled from 8% to 30%. And the reason I've chosen that figure is that's pre-pandemic. The National Children's Bureau found in a study that 24% of girls were depressed and 9% of boys. And in a YouGov student survey, 34% of female students reported mental health problems and 19% of men. So you can see that there are significant differences in the figures. And perhaps we could start with you to ask you, what do you think is going on? And do you think it is a crisis? Is a crisis overstating it?
Well, I think Tamsin would be better at answering a lot of that, because I mostly work on brain development and social cognitive development in adolescence, whereas Tamsin is really the world expert on mental health and mental illness in young people. But from my point of view, I mean, I know the figures, and I mean, anyone who says this isn't a crisis hasn't read the figures. It is a crisis. I mean, I think it's a crisis in general in terms of mental health, not just in young women and girls, also in men and boys as well. But it seems that the crisis has been particularly pronounced in women and girls, and I can talk a bit about why that might be in terms of brain development and cognitive development. But maybe you want to wants to comment on the first
maybe
question.
She should have chaired. Tamsin,
pass it over.
Well, so I'm an epidemiologist. So, and I no longer have to explain that, thanks to COVID, one of the few benefits. So my business is really counting reliably. And if we'd had this conversation maybe 8-9 years ago, I'd have been deeply skeptical. We were already getting signals from various studies that there was something going on with young women. So there are a series of national adult surveys, and for the first time ever in 2014, there was a sudden uptick in anxiety, depression and self-harm amongst 16 to 24-year-olds. That was the first time it was recorded. Referrals to mental health services for young women were going up, but there was always a disjunct. I trained somewhere where the files were different colours for boys and girls. And so boys had green-coloured folders and girls had buff-coloured folders. And the services developed, dealing with children, it was mainly green folders and a few buff folders, whereas those dealing with adolescents, suddenly you get this swing to more girls. And I just wasn't convinced. So when more people come forward for help, that could partly be because people feel more able to come forward for help. But it doesn't necessarily mean there are more people with problems in the community. And there was a study that was published in about 2014 that compared data over 20 years, so repeated cross-sectional samples, so different people filling in the questionnaires, but the same questionnaires, and there were some in England and in Scotland and in Wales. And broadly, what they showed was no convincing change in the actual scores that you got on this measure. But both parents and young people were more likely to say, yes, I think I have a problem, or I think my child has a problem. So there is an element going on of people being more willing to seek help. And that is good, because mental health conditions are tractable and we have effective treatment if only we had enough people to supply them. I think what has happened since then is the harder epidemiological data, the scores on scales, the sophisticated diagnostic assessments are actually telling a tale where this is not just more people being willing to say, I think I'm struggling. This is actually translating into more children and young people, particularly girls in their mid to late teens and early 20s, who are really struggling with their mental health and they're impaired. So, as I say, I think we went into the pandemic with this situation crystallising, and the pandemic has only made it worse. The pandemic has impacted everybody's mental health, but it is worse in teenagers compared to younger children, and it's particularly bad in that older age group amongst girls and young women.
Thank you. Now, Lauren, did you, as a teacher, how did you notice this problem coming along?
I think when I think about my students' health, I always think about it on a spectrum, and I think it's important to note that you do have a whole subsection of girls who their mental health is thriving, but you also have this proportion of students who are struggling, and sometimes they are very open about their struggle. Sometimes you might notice it in terms of them becoming quieter in a classroom context. That's one way where people can kind of show you without telling you. But conversely, you might see it of people becoming broader and bigger and sort of louder in a classroom context. So how that struggle kind of presents itself to you as a teacher can be really different. And I think that speaks to all of the different kind of mental health issues which women can be suffering with.
And did you notice that there were more girls and young women behaving in ways that appeared to indicate that they were distressed in some way?
Yes, I think particularly when you get into the sort of GCSE and A-level years, that's where you start to really notice it as a teacher. And I think there is a specific group where I would say high achieving, sort of perfectionist tendencies almost, that's the group where I would say you most notice it as a teacher when you get into those exam years.
Thank you. So, Sarah-Jayne, what's your perspective on what we're talking about here?
Well, I'm interested in the development of the brain in adolescence and development of cognitive processing and the social world, the social behaviour. And I became interested in why, quite a few years ago, with a colleague, Glyn Lewis, who's also a child and adolescent psychiatrist like Tamsin, but he's based at UCL. We became interested in the question of why do you see this very sudden increase that Tamsin mentioned in the prevalence of mental health problems like depression and anxiety and self-harm and eating disorders in girls after puberty? that striked us and many other people that puberty must be a really key factor. And so we were looking in the literature as to why that might be. And, lots happens at puberty. So you have this big increase in sex hormones. Boys and girls, the sex hormones are different. In girls, one of the sex hormones that increases sharply at puberty is estrogen, and there are quite a lot of animal research studies showing that estrogen has effects on mood by itself, has direct effects on mood, and also in humans now as well, that's been shown. That increase in sex hormone also can affect the brain, can trigger changes in the brain, particularly in subcortical regions that are associated with emotion processing and reward processing, the limbic system. But also, and I think maybe even over and above that, puberty changes the way people look. I mean, that's the main outcome of puberty as you become a sexually mature adult, and in terms of your reproductive ability, and it changes your secondary sexual characteristics appear. You grow, you go through a growth spurt, and suddenly you look very different, and you get treated very differently by society and by people around you, and your views on yourself change as well, like how you're seen by others suddenly starts to affect you more, and you experience more social pressures and more kind of social expectations of how you should be. You're given more responsibilities, more culpability, more autonomy. So massive changes at around puberty, and puberty in girls also happens at around the age that most girls go from small primary schools to big secondary schools. Again, another huge social change in the social environment. All these things are happening at the same time. And I think together, we don't really know which factor influences mood and mental health more than any other, but probably altogether those factors increase vulnerability for mental health problems, particularly in girls. The same isn't so true for boys. There is an increase in mental health, Tamsin will know more about this than I do, but mental health problems in boys, but it's a bit later, seems to be more like late adolescence, and not so associated with puberty, interestingly. So I think puberty has a lot to answer for, and it's direct effects on mood, brain, and indirect effects on the way society treats young women particularly, and the new pressures put on girls.
So if I look at, I'm 70, and I went to an all-girls school. There were a few girls who had problems, but the problems were definitely much rarer. And what else do you think is happening now? And obviously, social media is one element. People being very aware of themselves. Also, the fact that clinical obesity is much more common at the moment, at a time that young women are being sort of taught to be obsessed with themselves.
Yeah.
Those body image issues.
I don't believe you're 70. You're not.
Still reeling from that.
So obviously everyone's always gone through puberty. Puberty's been around forever. But actually in the last 50 years, it has decreased the average age of puberty by a little bit in most countries in the world for lots of reasons, mostly nutrition. And so now, by the end of primary school, 25% of girls will have started their periods. That wasn't true 50 years ago. And so a lot of a normal age to start puberty within the normal range is 8. For girls, not for boys. Boys go through puberty a couple of years later than girls, and I also think that's really key. These girls who are going through puberty quite early, but within the normal range, there's nothing wrong with them. That's a big mismatch between their kind of physical maturity and the number of years they've been alive, their life experience, their social maturation, their brain maturation. I think that can put a lot of pressure on the system, but also there is evidence that girls who have late puberty timing, that means early puberty timing. That means they start puberty younger than their peer group, are at particular risk for internalizing problems like depression and anxiety. And perhaps that's a social comparison thing. You don't want to be different from your friends. And we're talking very young now, 8, 9, 10. That'll be those girls who are going through puberty early. And again, that doesn't happen with boys. There's no evidence that going through puberty earlier than your peers for boys is a risk factor. So I think puberty does in itself have different, creates different issues for girls because it happens earlier in girls. But what else has changed? I mean, huge amounts has changed. I think there is more pressure on actually both sexes in adolescence these days. Exam pressures, academic pressures, things like if you ask young people, many surveys have, what do you find stressful in your life? Social media is way down the list, by the way. Right. So it's interesting that they themselves don't actually see it as a big problem, although I'll come back to that. That doesn't mean it isn't. But they'll cite things like exam pressure and fear of failure and academic stress. They'll also cite things like worries about the future, worries about getting on the housing ladder, the job market. They'll cite things like climate change. I suppose external pressures like that, external stresses like that have always been present in all young people's lives throughout history. But I think we are right now living in a time where there are multiple pressures coming in from all angles, and all these things are amplified by social media. There's no getting away from them. You can't hide from the climate crisis and the terrifying nature of the climate crisis. And young people are, hugely affected by the climate crisis. It will affect them most. They're the ones who will feel pressured to do something about it. They'll be the only ones to be able to do something about it. That's a really big existential concern for young people now. Now, that doesn't actually explain the sex difference, but all these things together, along with interacting with earlier puberty and other things that are specific to girls, might explain something.
Thank you. So, Lauren, did you notice, even compared to when you'd been at school, more awareness about body image issues and general issues about appearance just being more dominant?
I think we live in an increasingly visual world, and I think social media does have a part to play on that. And when I went to school, certainly when I was younger, I went home, and that's when sort of like school and peer influence stopped. But nowadays, students go to school and then they go home, and those pressures kind of carry and sometimes, in some cases, amplify outside of school. So I think it's not having that break from those pressures, which is really important, and also those images, the filter culture, all of those things going around, I think really do impact, and you see in students and the conversations you have with them and the things they think about, that yes, that social media element does definitely, I would say, influence them.
And we also know that 80% of people by the age of 18 have watched violent pornography, and also that I think it's more than 50% of young people of about that age think it's normal for a girl to enjoy or experience violent aggression in sex. I don't know if you have any thoughts about what the potential effects are, Tamsin, of taking all that inside yourself, because often you feel that you read about people being concerned that boys are watching pornography and how that's affecting boys. But we now know that, sadly, girls are watching it as well. What sort of effect could that have, seeing those sorts of denigrating, unreal images?
I think that's a really interesting question, and one that I'm not terribly qualified to answer. But I think the point that Lauren's just made is really valid. So, I'm in my, just about get away with saying, mid-50s. I also went to an all-female school. There was probably, in my year, there was at least one person who clearly had an eating disorder, not that, everyone knew, nobody did anything about it. And there were probably a few others whose mental health was notably poor, but nowhere near the kind of figures, I guess, this is not a proper epidemiological survey, but, nowhere near the kind of level of issues that are being reported now. And yes, people did access pornography, but it was quite hard to get hold of. You had to work quite hard. These days, I think the problem is that these things are very accessible, along with, pro-anorexic, pro-self-harm, really, really unpleasant content is available on the internet, and there isn't that break from it because it's there and it's on your mobile phone and people can just send it to you. I think it's more the kind of intrusiveness and the lack of time to reflect, although this is not based on empirical research. In the last big national survey of children and young people done in this country, which involved just over 9,000 youngsters from the age of 2 up to the age of 19, there were questions about social media. And instead of just asking about screen time, because actually I think it is the content of what you're looking at that's important, not how much you're on it. There was, of course, this was data gathered at the same time, so we can't conclude whether poor mental health is caused by social media or actually whether you're more inclined to get on social media if your mental health is poor because perhaps you're doing less of other things. But certainly those with mental health conditions were more likely to report feeling out of control, were more likely to report, interestingly, both being cyberbullied and cyberbullying, which suggests, there's something about good peer relationships there that, may be a lever for us as us as a society to respond to this. And also that they felt that they couldn't be themselves. They were much more likely to say that they felt they had to project a persona, which, what we really lack in this area is good longitudinal data of sufficiently representative samples to be able to answer these questions, which are just so important.
I don't know whether when you, in your school, and you're not here to answer for the whole education system, but the extent to which as teachers you felt that you had the knowledge and capacity to deal with the way in which young people are using social media, and the fact that so many are watching pornography, for example, but standard sex education doesn't really take all those issues on. It's quite a big thing for a school to really consider developing a curriculum that dealt with something so grim and controversial.
Yeah, I think it's a very big challenge for schools because sex education and sort of issues around well-being are quite often within a PSHE curriculum, so a personal social health education curriculum. And ideally, those curriculums would be built around your school population and their specific issues and the needs that they have. But that's a very dynamic thing, so you have to be constantly on top of and aware and have the evidence there to know how to tackle those issues. As a teacher, I have delivered PSHE. I was a psychology teacher, but quite often the teachers, like psychology teachers or social science teachers, would pick up a PSHE lesson, and I think that's a problem in itself because nobody really is a specialist. You don't have a sex education teacher at every school. So I think thinking about who is delivering and designing those curriculums, because quite often it's something which schools do, but I don't know how well they really do it, and it's quite like, oh, we have a spare period there, so that teacher will come in. And I was very comfortable talking about issues, but that's because of my background of a psychology teacher. You might actually have a maths teacher who happens to have a timetable gap, who has been assigned Year 9 PSHE, and their ability to cope with a conversation about pornography or mental health without training. It's very rare that they would have additional training for them to undertake those conversations. That's a very big challenge. So I think the variability is a really big issue to think about and overcome, and how we deliver those curriculums and who delivers them.
Well, one of our alumni, Mary Edwards, who had a classics degree, told me that when she arrived at her school in her first job, she was told that the new teacher always teaches sex education. And, well, there are various things I can remember from Latin and Greek that might be relevant, but, and she was just handed some papers and had absolutely no idea how to do it. And of course, since we're talking about the education system here, the pressure that you see in newspapers is actually to talk about all these things less, not to talk about them more.
It's definitely a very sensitive topic, and there will be families, students who are more and less open to talking about them, but creating that safe space and having those conversations and involving people who are less comfortable about talking about them, just because it's difficult, I don't think we should shy away from it.
So, I mean, we've established that there are really significant problems and looked at some of the causes. But we're here also to talk about the education system. And in one study that I've seen, the group most likely to say that they were unhappy about their mental health were girls aged 16 to 17. But that's the age at which you do GCSEs and start preparing for your A-levels. So what thoughts do you have about how imposing that sort of pressure in that very, very sensitive age group is going to affect the population of girls at school?
Yes, I mean, I thought a lot about GCSEs, and I've been involved in various education organisations like the Times Education Commission, which were looking at various aspects of it, our education system, including assessments, including GCSEs. So I've thought a lot about it. And I think one key issue here is that GCSEs were brought in the late 80s when absolutely nothing was known about how the human brain develops. It was only, I mean, in the mid-90s, I was an undergraduate and I was taught that the human brain stops developing in childhood, which we now know is completely wrong. And in fact, the human brain continues to develop throughout childhood, of course, and throughout adolescence and even into the 20s, stabilizing at some point in the 20s or early 30s, lots of individual differences. But, you know, that gives you a bit of context. GCSEs were created when nothing was known about how the teenage brain develops. And actually now we know loads, and we know how teenagers' minds are also changing and how the teenage years are characterized by heightened creativity, exploration, risk-taking, social change, social cognitive improvements in executive functions like decision-making and planning. Would we really, if we were designing the education system, particularly the assessment system now, would we really design it the way it is and, you know, stuff knowledge into teenagers and then get them to regurgitate it in about 25 exams when they're 16, which, as you say, is the peak age for the development of mental health problems? I don't think anyone would. GCSEs, I don't think are in, I think there's a big mismatch between GCSEs, both in terms of curriculum, marking schemes and assessments, number of exams, the type of exams, this kind of regurgitation of very short-term memory, or facts in very short-term memory, is not suited to what we know about the way the teenage brain develops. And, you know, GCSEs are, again, if you ask young people, they'll say that their biggest stress in their life are the multiple exams they have throughout their secondary school years. GCSEs are very, very stressful. I have two teenagers, one's going through A-levels, the other's going through GCSEs right now. I mean, it's sustained pressure over many, many weeks, and the amount of information they have to learn in that short time is enormous, which strikes me as weird anyway, because why do we need to retain all this information when we have Google? But we also know from memory research, I mean, I'm not a memory researcher, but lots of my colleagues are, and there's lots of research on memory and the best way to retain memories in the long term. That is not, GCSEs are not it. Yes, they'll might retain some memory for, a week after the exams, but after that, it's all gone. So I think GCSEs are not really fit for purpose anymore. And neither does the man who brought them into the education system in the late 80s, and many people who work in schools and the education system also agree. The question is how to get them changed, because there's a big resistance to change in education policy, and also a change would take many years, whereas governments tend to work in 5-year cycles, and you probably need more than a 5-year outlook to incorporate any major changes in educational structure and assessment structure. But what a shame, because I really don't think it's doing our young people any good.
And of course, many people here will be aware that GCSEs, introduced by Lord Baker, who now says that they are obsolete, were school leaving certificates, and now you're not allowed to leave school at 18. I mean, you've taught them. I can still remember how ghastly they were. I think maybe worse than having a baby. I mean, they were just awful. What's it like when you're not the individual, you're the teacher, facing all these very stressed girls and boys?
I actually find supporting students through exams more stressful in some ways than going through my own exams, because you have 100 students, all who are feeling very different ways at different times, and as a teacher you really do care and carry their sort of stresses with you, although you don't let them know that externally. Internally you do take that on as a teacher. But I couldn't agree more in terms of the idea that this regurgitation and retention of information as a sort of an education structure is just so useless now. In the past, it was really important that you had people who did know things and could retain them, because we couldn't just look them up. But when we are in an age of information and we all have phones and, as Sarah says, Google at our fingertips, why are we forcing this sort of content-driven education system? I think that shift to skills-based education would be really valuable and actually more useful moving forward.
Yeah.
And of course, only about half of those children go on to do A-levels and the sort of academic course that is tested at GCSE. What are your thoughts about GCSEs?
Well, speaking as a clinician, so I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist as well as a researcher, clinically the number of exam-related mental health crises that I dealt with is huge, and there will be young women and some young men, both school age and university age, who just find, for whatever reason, usually because there are other things going on as well, that, it's just too much. I totally agree. People aren't leaving school for another 2 years, so why do they have to do this high stakes exam a couple of years before that doesn't really help them develop the skills? So problem solving, conflict resolution, being able to negotiate, presenting information well. There's so many other things that we should be helping our young people develop the skills in that would be useful for their lives going forward, would give them a sense of mastery, but also what employers want and need, rather than the ability to remember. I mean, in my own personal experiences, there are so many exams, and in the first year of medical school, I think we had 11 professional exams. There are so many exams that I passed on something I read 2 minutes before I walked in. If you asked me a week later, I would be clueless, which is probably not what you want to hear from a medical practitioner. But hey, we have Google.
Yeah. But in different statistics I've seen, girls and young women are about twice as likely to suffer what people call test anxiety as men. And you actually told me that it's not an exam, but that your supervisor said that you should plan your PhD like a man, as a man would. And I thought that was an interesting point. But also the people who run our education system, they're men and women. They've tended to be dominated by men who've perhaps really excelled at, they've been taught from an early age to be confident in exams, and they've maybe excelled in exams, and they think that they're great because exams are great for some people.
Can I comment on that?
Yes.
Boys do worse in exams at GCSEs and A-levels than girls, which is kind of interesting. There's like a mismatch there. They're more confident, but they do worse. And I think that's partly the why, because actually the confidence doesn't really help when you have to learn masses of information. Whereas if you're unconfident, you start revising, weeks or months in advance because you're so worried about it and so anxious about it. So I think those two things go hand in hand. But like you, when I was at university, at my university, overall, men got a third more firsts and a third more thirds than women did. So women were getting majority 2-1, 2-2s, and men were getting lots of firsts and thirds. And there was a big investigation into why this is and all these different hypotheses being tested. And the main conclusion was that the way finals exams, unlike GCSEs and A-levels, the way finals exams are marked at universities like this is you're looking for someone who is confident in their argument, who's willing to take a risk and just go for it, make an argument, back it up with evidence, and hope for the best. And that can either work out really well and get you a first, or it can work out really badly and get you a third. And men are more likely to have that confidence to take that risk. And so I went into my finals exams thinking, think like a man, be confident in your answers. But yeah, in terms of GCSEs, it's a completely different tool set. It's different things are being tested, and actually when teaching undergraduates here, I often say to them, because they want to know about the mark scheme. They want to know what do I have to answer in this essay in order to get a first or whatever. I'm like, forget about mark schemes. There's no perfect essay. There's no ideal essay. That we don't even provide them with previous years, excellent essays, because we don't want them to think, this is the only way to write a really good essay. This is the prototype. So they have to, not only is the education system in our country doing the wrong thing and testing people wrongly, they also have to, if you go to university, you have to kind of unlearn it. You have to unlearn the way you were taught to pass exams if you want to do well in your university degree. So
so it's not even training people for academia. I mean, it's so
definitely not.
It's
just tangential to what you need to do in academia.
But it may be stereotypical, the idea that the perfectionist girl is searching for the right answer, and how does this issue of perfectionism and women studying really hard to do it right, how does that impact on them?
Yeah, I think that's all bound up in the same thing. Perfectionism is a sort of outcome of lack of confidence in a way, and also perfectionism results in being very anxious, or can result in being very anxious about exams and coursework and doing a lot of work on them, which actually ends up getting good marks often. But also it's kind of reduces the willingness to take risks, because if you're a perfectionist, you want to write down exactly what you know is right, what you've read in textbooks. So that's good for your GCSEs and A-levels, and girls do better than boys in them generally, but not good for university degrees. So I think that perfectionism is a key. I mean, I don't know much about it from a scientific point of view, actually, perfectionism as a kind of cognitive trait.
We need Ros Shafran, who studied it, but I think if she were here, what she would say is, a little bit of it, and obsessionality likewise, and anxiety is good. Let's not forget that we trip ourselves up in this area because we use language in a really sloppy way. So we use the same words to describe something that is a completely normal experience. It is normal. It's part of human life to feel anxious. We have emotions for good reasons. If you are going for a job interview and you don't feel anxious, well, then it's probably you don't want the job. However, you know, a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of stress increases your performance. But if it gets too much and overwhelms somebody, then your performance very quickly drops off. And then at the other end of the spectrum, anxiety or depression can become an actual disorder where, you know, the feelings are persistent and they're, you know, persisting over days, weeks, months for some people. They're interfering with sleep, appetite, relationships, your ability to function. At that point, what you have is a medical condition, and yet we use the same word to describe all of that. And there's a world of difference between the everyday, you know, experience of getting a bit anxious before something that's a big deal to basically not being able to function and needing treatment for a health condition.
I wanted to ask you something about that, following up on that point. So Lucy Folks is a researcher at Oxford now, and she's written a book called Losing Our Minds. She's interested in adolescent mental health, and one of her ideas is that we talk so openly now about mental health problems, and we overuse terms like anxiety and depression, and so young people kind of self-diagnose themselves with these conditions even when they're just feeling like normal levels of anxiety or low mood. And I wondered what you think about that, and whether there's a tendency to do that more in girls than in boys.
That's a really interesting thought, and it would make a very nice research study. So I don't know the answer, but I'm quite tempted to go and try and
we'll
find out.
ask Lucy to do it.
Yeah, we'll ask Lucy to do it. I would highly recommend her book,
Yeah,
Losing Our Minds. It's one of the best books that I've read recently, and it's beautifully written. It's so accessible, and she really unpacks this problem, and I think she's right.
Yeah.
I think she's right. And it's about the sloppy use of language. So, you know, you hear people on the radio in various places saying, oh, I've got mental health. And it's such a ridiculous thing to say. We all have mental health. That's why I'm a psychiatrist. It's more interesting than other branches of medicine because, you know, we all have a mental state. You can have cancer or not have cancer. You can be having a heart attack or not have a heart attack. But actually, people always have a mental state to talk about. But we use the word mental health in order to try and be inclusive and not stigmatizing. In fact, what we're doing, and Lucy makes this point really well, is that we're robbing people who have a mental health condition from the language with which to describe it. But I think she also has a very good point that, yes, talking about your feelings and being willing to seek help when you need it is really important. But actually, we also need to help people, but particularly our young people, to understand that actually, you know, the WHO definition of health, which is complete and utter social, mental and social well-being, is very aspirational. Most of us won't be there for most of our lives. That, you know, there will be times we feel anxious and we feel low, and it's for a good reason, but it's not necessarily a disorder if it's fairly fleeting. So an anecdote to illustrate this, a friend of mine was talking to me about being absolutely mortified by her child's behaviour, and I think her child at the time was about 9 or 10, so top end of primary school. And she had a spat with her friends, during which she said, I hate you all and I want to die, which was taken seriously as a suicidal threat. And of course it wasn't. It was a 9-year-old throwing a tantrum, which she probably should have known, but the response actually escalated. And the final parting comment was my friend saying, and, you know, 6 children were so traumatised from the WhatsApp that they had to go and see the therapy dog. To which I thought, can you just listen to what you're saying? I'm sure they all wanted to go and see the therapy dog. They have them in Addenbrooke's, and it brightens up my lunchtime every time I see them. I always stop and have a cuddle, but I don't need to go and see the therapy dog. I wanted to go and see the therapy dog, and I'm sure the little darlings were perfectly aware of how you get to go and see the therapy dog as well.
There's such a shortage now of psychologists and psychiatrists in the NHS.
Yes, they're now using
that the government may introduce you to the dog will see you now. But yeah, and you know, as somebody involved in building a well-being service in a college, I have to be aware that we shouldn't undermine people's confidence in their own mental health.
And their ability to cope. And that we will all have to struggle with uncomfortable feelings at times, but if it's lasting over days, it's interfering with your ability to eat or sleep and your relationships and your ability to do what you need to do in your everyday life, at that point, it's becoming a disorder, and that's the point to reach out and get help. And we should be more celebratory, I think. You know, psychiatrists tend to be, and psychologists tend to be a bit apologetic. We have really good evidence-based interventions for people who do have a disorder. But like many medicines, they're not necessarily going to do you a whole lot of good if you don't have that level of problem to begin with.
Now, we're going to continue speaking, but I do invite people, and can just about see them, if you would like to join in the conversation. We would really like to hear from you with any question or point. We've touched on the fact that maybe 16 and 17 isn't a good age for 125 exams, but also I believe one of you told me we're the only country in the world that have 2 sets of exams between 16 and 18. Was it you?
Well, yes, because I was getting...
And I did
take me
wonder,
up on that.
you know, maybe they do something in Tibet that I'm not aware of, but you know,
Well,
testing you at 16 and then testing you at 18.
Yeah, like you said, the 16 exams were originally brought in as a leaving certificate. Now they're not, because everyone has to stay in some form of educational training till 18. And then if you look at other countries where they have to stay, where kids have to stay in school or education training until 18, they don't tend to have 2 sets of high-stakes national exams at both 16 and 18. The only countries who do are like Commonwealth countries that follow the British system.
So it's a colonialist plot as well. You've also talked to me about how when they changed A-levels from being modular to linear, and you might want to explain to people what that means, how that noticeably increase the amount of stress in girls?
Yeah, so I think high stakes is a really important thing here. So we used to have a system where we would have something called modular A-levels and GCSEs, and that meant that you would study a topic, and then at the end of that topic you would take an exam, and that would go towards sort of 20%, and you would it would be cumulative, and you would build up, and then at the end you would have your score. But they reformed the education system and decided that they wanted to scrap those sort of interim assessments, and the only thing that would matter would be this sort of end of the 2 years examinations, and I think high stakes is the really important thing there. So, for girls, as from my personal experience as a teacher, I would say it was most noticeable in that sort of female group which I described earlier, where all of a sudden, instead of you kind of like slowly having it feeling like there's multiple chances and you sort of know where you're at, you find your feet a little bit with exams. I think sometimes you have to warm into them and the pressures and go through and slowly develop your systems of how to cope. But all of those chances were gone, and it became this like almost one shot to get it right type environment. And we kind of know, as having gone through exams and being successful in some things and failing at others, that actually it doesn't really matter. But when you're in that moment and you're taking your GCSE, it feels like this is the start or end of my life, and my journey is going to go this way or that way. And yeah, that pressure of succeeding in education, I think there's been a shift of the priority and the purpose, and I think young people do take their education a lot more seriously now, certainly than when I was at school.
Absolutely.
And I think maybe that is felt a little bit more by girls and women, because it has been a hard-fought battle in terms of access to education. What we're doing sitting here today in some places in the world would be illegal. For me, for example, to be getting a PhD, that would be illegal. So we know of both the power of education, but also the privilege of education as well. So I think that's really important.
Well, when I was at school, hardly anybody from my convent went to university, and the expectations of my life were low. so that actually was less pressurized in many ways.
Yeah, it's really complex because you kind of do want to have all those conversations around access, and it's important, but doing it in a way where, yes, that pressure doesn't sit very heavy on people's shoulders, and it is the choice.
No, I think somebody here has a point.
Thank you for the interesting conversation. I'm really enjoying it. I also don't know why I was memorizing my geography when I was doing my IGCSEs, but anyway, I had to learn about clouds. I have a question about parents, parents that may not be accepting about the mental health conversations, and can be due to different things, maybe background, different beliefs, etc., etc. How best do you think we can integrate mental health education into the home setup so that parents are also supportive of their kids, and we don't have a system where in the education system we're trying to make things work, we're promoting good mental health and well-being, but when they go home, there's this leak that's there and we go back to square one. How best can we do that?
Shall I
Yes.
have a go at that one? Thank you. That's a really interesting and quite tough question. I think there has been a massive shift, and it goes back to that study that showed over the last 20 years, parents and young people are more willing to say, I think I have a problem, or I think my child has a problem. You know, I can't imagine when I was a child having programs like Super Nanny, which was a program that was on, probably about 10 years ago now, about, you know, a woman who I don't think she was a nanny. I'm not entirely sure she was super either, but she would go and work with a family, and of course the television would be, you know, they'd edit it, I think, to show really appalling behaviour, and then she would suggest a few different ways of doing things, and by the end of the hour-long episode, everything was hunky-dory. There was a better quality television program called The House of Little Tearaways with
Tanya Byron.
Yeah, Tanya Byron, which was much, much better and actually much more
Very good.
evidence-based. But actually the fact that that was on primetime television is a real cultural shift for this country. So I think it does depend a little bit on the conversations we have at a societal level about how people understand what mental health is and what it isn't. So maybe we should be making everyone read Lucy Fuchs' book.
Yeah.
I'm trying. I think there is making sure that when parents are worried about their child, they can get good information. So the Royal College of Psychiatrists has a section on children and young people, which has got information sheets for young people, but also for parents and also for practitioners working with them. MindEd is another more detailed a website that you can Google, which has information, you know, similarly about topics to help people. And then I think any practitioners working with children and young people needs to be reaching out to families and trying to have a conversation with them and trying to plug people in to where they can find information. But I think we also need to be careful not to alienate parents, because often I think any practitioners who work with children and families, the identification with the child is kind of seeping out of the chairs in the waiting room, and parents often feel like it must be my fault my child is struggling, or my child can't cope at school, or whatever the issue is, and they come in feeling like everyone's going to think it's my fault and defensive. So I think you need to get alongside people to help change hearts and minds, and I think there's an individual families aspect, and then there's a more sort of public health, what information can we get out there for everybody? And it would help, I think, if our government and our policymakers had a really good idea of what good mental health is and what good mental health services would look like too. So I think we've got a massive education issue.
Can I follow up on that? Just to give a slightly different angle. So I do some work with Alan Stein in Oxford, he's a child and adolescent psychiatrist in Oxford, and I'm involved in this big project that he's running in Uganda and South Africa on very poor communities there, where mental illness does not exist as a concept. There are no words for depression or anxiety, they're very, very stigmatized. So if a young person or an adult starts to show symptoms, they are ostracized by their societies. But when you actually do proper assessments of the young people in those communities, they have the same rates as depression and anxiety as we have here. That is there. It's just there's no words for it and it's stigmatized still. So in those countries, the problem is so much more acute than here, actually, because there's no societal support.
I think we shifted. My mother is the generation of, we didn't get stressed in my day. I mean, I think she actually has a clinical anxiety disorder and has lived one for most of her adult life. But, you know, she'd still say, well, I don't suffer with stress. It's all other people, she'd say. It's like, well, I think it's also...
Well, in my mother's
but
era,
that's a
they were all
generational
on Valium.
Yeah. But they weren't stressed. They didn't get stressed. They
Well,
just
it
had
was the Valium help. But I know that you, you're looking at a course, a new psychology course, which would build into it the concept of well-being. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that, and it might help some other people in other departments to know about it.
So I based in the psychology department just across the road, and I won't bore you with the details, but currently you can get a psychology degree from Cambridge either by doing it via natural sciences or via PBS, Psychology and Behavioural Sciences. PBS is quite a new course. We are changing the structure of things next year, so starting in 2024, so that you'll only be able to get a psychology degree through the PBS course. And we are completely restructuring the PBS course because of this. That means we are thinking about, you know, what content to include, what years to teach it in, how to assess it, and that kind of thing. At the same time, you know, I came to Cambridge from UCL about 3.5 years ago. I was pretty shocked at the mental health of students in this university. Students are quite stressed, and staff are too, actually, quite stressed. I mean, they are at UCL, but the difference was observable, I think. And it's not surprising. The terms are short here. There's enormous amounts of pressure. There are loads of essays. You're amongst people who are, you know, very competitive. So we thought, now is the time. Now we're changing the structure and the content of the PBS course. We can do that bearing mental health in mind. Like, let's not just think about it from an academic point of view. What do they need to learn to get a good psychology degree? But what don't they need to learn? What can we push out of the course? Are we pushing too much content here? Because in my view, these courses have they've updated their content, adding more and more and more, but they haven't taken anything away over the last 30 years. And also assessment, again, going back to GCSEs, the same applies to degrees. Still, in this university and most universities, we assess by getting people to write as fast as they can for 3 hours about, you know, as much stuff as they can put on paper. Is that really what they need to go out into the world and get a job? When is that going to be a useful skill in the world of work and in their lives? So we're thinking about whether we can bring in other types of assessment, like giving, you know, oral speeches and Q&A sessions and other kinds of assessments, and maybe have some choice so that people who really, really don't like giving speeches don't have to do that. People who really don't like writing essay exams don't have to do that. Not complete choice, but, you know, on some modules. So we are going to do this properly and do evaluations before and after the change, evaluations of perception of the course, perception of their own, you know, how stressful they find it, their mental health, and also compare with another tripos, as we call it here, another course that isn't changing in 2024. So watch this space.
Well, interesting.
Maybe your department could take the lead in helping other departments in the university to build in the idea of well-being when considering how much content there is in a course and the form of assessment. What do you think?
I think we really need to think about it. I mean, I'm not terribly involved in medical education, but I'm aware these kind of discussions are going on. So I think the undergraduate medical education here is unusual in that people essentially, everyone does a 3-year degree, mainly natural scientists, although I think you get a fair number of medical students coming over to psychology for their 3rd year. And then they do 3 years of clinical training. And we're lucky here that the clinical school is actually pretty modern. that everybody who came in, started their medical training in Cambridge, actually finishing up their clinical training here is just within the last 20 years, in fact, less than that. So the clinical course is actually very modern because they really had carte blanche to reorganise it. But they're thinking about the undergraduate exams and making some, you know, let's have a bit less biochemistry, because frankly, the Krebs cycle is really not, you know, not that useful to know. Certainly you don't need to be able to recite it like I had to. But actually, you know, understanding epidemiology is key. So let's get some epidemiology in there. So I think we're behind you, and I'm not sure there's quite such an emphasis on well-being. But I shall be speaking to the clinical dean and recommending he comes to speak to you.
I mean, you know, there is resistance to this because there's resistance to change. You know, we've done this for 800 years. Stick with it.
Well, I think we've got... Oh, did you just have your hand up or you wanted to make a point? Just briefly.
I hadn't heard much about disability, and from my experience, there's a lot of undiagnosed disability, and women and girls are so much more likely to be masking in very convincing ways. And I get a lot of people now coming to me wanting diagnosis for ADHD and ASD, and guess what? It often comes up positive. But also there is an incentive to medicalise and pathologise problems, because that's how you unlock the support. That's how you get adjustments in place. So, yeah, that's what I'm experiencing, that's what I'm seeing.
Thank you. And then one point here before we finish.
Lady in the green jumper.
Wait, no, I think you need to wait for it because people just can't hear.
Thank you very much. I just wondered if the panel had any quick wins that schools could introduce to support people's mental health.
Can I jump in there? I think your school culture is, you know, I think firstly, most of the variance in mental health between schools is accounted for by the individual characteristics of the pupils coming in. And that's not something, you know, that's your catchment area. The tractable bit that influences mental health, both cross-sectionally but also longitudinally, is the school culture. So working hard to have positive relationships between staff and pupils, between staff and each other, and between pupils. Bullying is probably our most tractable public health problem. And there are lots of evidence-based ways of stopping it. We're just not very good at implementing it. So relationships are key, but also inclusiveness, a warm, welcoming culture where voices are heard and decisions are, you know, include the pupil voice, but also include staff voice. So pay attention to your school culture is what I'd say.
I would add to that, shifting the focus away from purely thinking about the academics being the most important thing to thinking about an engaged student, and a happy, healthy student is the most important thing. And then quite often you'll find that the academic stuff follows if you prioritise that.
Thank you. Well, I think we've had lots of great ideas here, and it would be good if all the people who run all the departments at Cambridge and other universities as well, of course, should watch this session, because I've certainly learned a lot, and that there are lots of positive things that we could do if we had the will to do it, to reduce, if not end, the crisis in the mental health of young women and girls. So please say thank you to our terrific panel. Thank you very much.